If you're a competitive Pokemon player, one of the worst things you could do is genning your team. You're gonna piss off someone here by mentioning even just the word pkhex. This is genuinely one of the single greatest issues that plays the integrity of the competitive scene to this day, and it's not for the reasons that you think. Today, let's break down the ethics of genning, and what it could actually offer for the competitive scene, and what might also be the problems with allowing your players to gen your Pokemon. I implore all of you guys, regardless of the side of the coin you fall on here, to leave your thoughts down below, as I think there's both a lot of positives and negatives with this, and I'm kind of curious where you guys ended up actually finding this video from. So first, let's start off with discussing why this video is even going to be made in the first place, because it's not really for the reasons that you guys think. I didn't get disqualified at any major events, and I'm not trying to come on here and damage control. It's actually been a topic though that has really come up, especially in the past few months, ever since the disqualifications that happened at Worlds 2023. World 2023 started disqualifying a ton of their players because of the fact that there was a lot of issues regarding the Pokemon that got introduced ever since Regulation D. Since Generation 9, there's been a lot of information regarding a home tracker that is present on a lot of Pokemon that are used in competitive events, and this causes a huge issue regarding Pokemon that are passable for events. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to get into how to avoid this, because frankly, this video is not something I'm intending for people to use for malicious purposes or use to increase their ability to get away with genning in events. That's not really the case here. What I am trying to do though is to discuss how genning, or at least the allowance of genning in a non-tournament aspect, could really help improve a lot of things. While I have no insight to how these hack checks ended up performing though, generally speaking, it was kind of assumed that if you genned in Urshifu straight into Scarlet and Violet, it was never going to be legal, because these Pokemon didn't have the proper data from their home game Sword and Shield. For example, let's take the hypothetical Urshifu for a moment. If I took a hypothetical Urshifu single and I gen this into Scarlet and Violet, the location data would have to have come from Sword and Shield, and because this Urshifu never actually touched Sword and Shield, this was an instant red flag for a lot of hack checks. This is why when a lot of these home exclusives ended up getting released, a lot of these bans started skyrocketing, and players were even warned before Worlds that they would be highly encouraged to obtain all of their own Pokemon through their own means. This means not trading your Pokemon with friends or getting your Pokemon from strangers online. It means actually catching these Pokemon yourselves and trading them up. And this ended up proving to be very fatal to a lot of players. While hacking's always existed in the competitive scene, we've never really seen a format that's been so heavily saturated with disqualifications. It actually feels more uncommon these days for players to completely get around losing a single Pokemon at a regional, or for just outright spot disqualifications to happen going into day 2. But is it justified? Well, the simple answer is objectively, it is. That's not to say that it should be morally, or the fact that these should be the rules to begin with, but it is the rules that exist, and therefore the fact that the Pokemon Company is at least enforcing them is a good sign. I'd much rather a stupid rule be in place that is at least being consistently enforced among all the players than for one to just exist and not be enforced, because otherwise all that does is scare the players who are thinking this rule will get enforced into never genning their teams in the first place. But should this rule exist to begin with, that might be a little bit more gray. There are definitely a few reasons where genning does give an objective advantage to players who do end up getting their teams through illegitimate ways. For starters, there is a time investment. And this time investment is a huge time sink in terms of getting your team. Well, Generation 9 has drastically improved several ways to get Pokemon, such as getting ability patches and bottle caps much more easily, and through the use of a lot of different other things such as nature mints. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of aspects of these games that take forever to get your Pokemon. Despite the improvements that came with the DLC in terms of getting things like Terra Shards, it still probably would take a full day's worth of time to get a competitive team completely from scratch. While you can take a team that already exists and take certain Pokemon from it and tweak their spreads with things like Fresh Start Mochi and Reset EVs to hopefully speed the time up for future teams, that first team will probably take you about 20 hours. This is a huge investment, and it's a huge hurdle to actually overcome when getting your first team for a regional. As someone who works full-time and manages 2 different channels that I am usually uploading on, trying to find time to work on a team definitely takes a lot, and this isn't a process I wish on anyone from someone who has actually done this from scratch before. While a lot of people will point to genning as really only an issue for time, there's actually a few other reasons where genning would give you a legitimate benefit in this generation. If you're a player who bought Violet, for example, and you bought this back in December thinking you picked the right version exclusive because Miraidon was that much better after your showdown testing, and you now are playing through VGC 2024 without any Pokemon like Raging Bolt and Gouging Fire, you now need to actually go and really think about deciding if you're going to buy the Scarlet copy that you are missing plus the DLC, or paying for your regional entry fee. And thankfully, if you don't want to have to make that decision, pkhex has your back. Genning is the easy solution to any player who ended up buying the wrong version of the game and needs those version exclusive Paradox Legends, because these are static encounters that you could only get one time in your game. While an event wouldn't exactly be the perfect solution for the entirety of the generation, this would be a really good way to at least give Violet players these Pokemon that they're missing, and it at least helps solve the issue for the current moment. This at least makes sure that I don't need to spend $90 to get the copy of the game that I am missing, plus the DLC for it, just to catch a couple of static Pokemon. This is a huge step back from even Sword and Shield's DLC, which at least gave me the option to choose which Urshifu I wanted or which Reggie I wanted, instead of making these version exclusives. And that's not to say that there aren't issues with version exclusives anyway, especially for these box arts, it can be pretty problematic. At least for the box arts that have such extreme variations of how good or bad they are compared to the other one, I can figure that out pretty quickly in the game's life cycle, and I can just wait a couple weeks to buy the game. But if I'm buying the game and then a year later new Pokemon are introduced that are version exclusives that drastically skew how I'm playing the game, I've now ended up unfortunately making the wrong decision because a year ago I just didn't have that foresight. Well, you could argue that most top tier competitive players are just going to buy both versions anyway so they can account for these version exclusives. That might be a viable option if your name is Wolf VGC, who could pay this off with the Orlando Regionals prize money, but Tyler Johnson over here has rent next month and is gonna have to settle for Thundurus if he wants a special electric type now. And if he doesn't have access to a past generation game such as Pokemon Legends Arceus or Sword and Shield, then he either needs to buy the DLC just for Regieleki or settle for a fucking Raichu. This isn't just hyperbole for the sake of an argument. I looked through all of the usage stats to prove this point, and somehow the highest non-DLC or post-game related option is fucking Raichu. If that all wasn't enough, jetting for players has even turned into an option that feels nearly required. If I want a Pokemon like a Namarus for Trick Room, good luck trying to get that one legitimately. If you ignore even obtaining a low attack IV, trying to get the 0 speed is going to be a nightmare, because you cannot check IVs in Pokemon Legends Arceus. Objectively, you need some sort of outside method such as pkhex with saved resetting in order to have a chance to viably reset for this Pokemon for its low speed IV without having to play through another entire copy of Legends Arceus, since you are required to save this Pokemon before you transfer it to home. This is by far one of the worst cases of accessibility in the history of Pokemon, and thankfully Namarus is not exactly the most viable pick. But that's not to say this issue will never happen again in another Pokemon game. So now that we've covered an actual reason outside of just time where there is merit, are there any other issues where genning could actually solve a core issue with the games? I'd argue there's one more, and this is probably actually going to be both the most biased reason I could give, but I think it's also the most fair. And this comes into the form of content creation. I will say though, for any sort of content, despite the fact that I don't gen my teams for tournaments, I am more than happy to gen teams for videos, and I think there's a lot of benefits you can actually get from genning teams for videos. For starters, it is a very easy way to give players a means of testing a team that they want that will not be brought to tournament because they cannot bring a rental code from another person. While I could test a team on Showdown, for example, it's not going to be the same feel as testing it in-game, where there's things like a mandatory timer and the fact that you kind of just have to figure things out on the in-game ladder, just like you would have to at a regional. While there never will truly be a perfect way to recreate the feel of an in-person best-of-3 tournament with forced open sheet on cartridge, at the same time, this is at least a good feel to get the cartridge experience replicated. Having content creators mass posting teams to showcase new rentals pretty much every day for some people ends up giving a great way to show someone that maybe Zapdos isn't the call for the next event, and instead they should probably just go pick up that copy of Scarlet just to get their Raging Bolt. However, on the flip side, maybe I don't like using Raging Bolt, and that's great because I don't need to spend $60 on another game and then another $30 on the DLC just to find out I didn't like the Pokemon in the first place. This is a great way to at least hopefully improve the experience and the accessibility for players overall without having to turn to a simulator, and instead it at least gives people a way where there's no real cash incentive, because if I gen my Pokemon, I'm winning a tournament. It's just the in-game ladder, I get a couple items in-game for doing well, and that's about where this ends. So now it's time to settle the actual topic of this video. Are there merits to genning your Pokemon? I think objectively, there are unfortunately ways where genning will have a positive impact, and I think it's entirely inflicted on the Pokemon company themselves. There are objectively ways that they could very easily fix this that are still in line with the spirit of the game. I'm not exactly talking about ways like creating a simulator game, which is really a lot of people's only solution for this. There's a lot of ways that could at least be reasonably implemented into a casual story game that don't just break the spirit of it. For example, let's say I have a copy of Scarlet and I have Gouging Fire. What if we made that like a weekly static encounter? At the very least, by doing that, or at least making them as common as options like Fluttermane and Brute Bonnet, I can now have it so I can join in a world with my friend, have them catch their own copy, and they have a legitimate Gouging Fire now. or even if it was just a weekly re-encounter where I can catch it again, I could just trade them that second copy, and there's no real harm to giving that up. Not only this, but having more ways to catch every home restricted legendary Pokemon by the end of this DLC would be a big plus, because I now need to get a second copy of the game just because the Reggies for the original trio or the Genies are all required to be caught outside of these games, despite the fact that they are still legal for competitive. Who thought that was a good idea? Finally, while I know this isn't the most original idea, a way to reduce IVs would be pretty nice. Because while we have the bottle caps, I heard someone actually mention in another video of mine that's a pretty good solution. Having it so you could just choose the exact IV you want would really be a great way to do it, even if it's just preset to 0 or 31. With these in mind, really the only negative aspect would be a timing thing. And while I won't act like there's never going to be a timing aspect due to the fact of how these games are played, at the very least, this is probably the most reasonable set of solutions that would still keep in line with the spirit of these games. And I think that, at least in itself, is a positive step forward that's not taking 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. What did you guys think of today's video? Did you learn something, or did you just find any reasons that could maybe have changed your opinion on the topic at all? Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, as I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on this, because I think there really is a lot to argue both for and against, even if we just go outside of the fact that objectively it is against the rules. Also, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I upload a lot of these discussion videos, and I think there's a lot to be learned from this channel, so if you enjoyed today's video, I hope that you enjoy the rest too, and I think that you will. Lastly, make sure you check out our editors. We have 2 right now, both who do an incredible job in this channel. The first being Kurt, who edited the video you're seeing today. And Kurt does an amazing job on all of our content on this channel, and I really couldn't do it without him. We also do have an editor who does a ton of our short form content, being Matt O'Shea, who does a ton of great work on our short form content. With that said, I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys next week for a hopefully a little bit less controversial idea. With that said, peace out, guys.